welcome to the Drexel interview. I'm your host, Paula Marantz-Cohen, and today our guest is Rabbi Harold S. Kushner. Rabbi Kushner's books have been an inspiration to millions of readers. These include When Bad Things Happen to Good People, Living a Life That Matters, How Good Do You Have to Be, and The Lord is My Shepherd. He's here today to speak about his latest book, Overcoming Life's Disappointments. Rabbi Kushner, welcome to the Drexel interview.
Thank you, Paula.
Your latest book, Overcoming Life's Disappointments, is an inspirational book. But unlike many self-help books, it's not about self-actualization. It's not about realizing goals and dreams, as so many of these sorts of books are. It's really about coming to terms with not realizing goals and dreams.
It's for all the people who bought those self-help books and found out they didn't help.
Who found themselves depressed by reading them.
Right. You know, it's really funny. I go to a bookstore sometimes. I'm always curious to see what section they have my books in. Are they in psychology, self-help, Judaica, religion, theology? When they ask me, I say, well, just start a new section for me and call it wisdom.
Wisdom. I like that. So where do they put your books? Do they tend to put them in self-help?
It varies from store to store. I can never find them.
Interesting. Yeah. No, it's not your traditional form of self-help. And I think you mention yourself in your books that you're rather uncomfortable with the idea of so many self-help books that seem to focus on the self so much, on the ego, on self-gratification, and that's a trend in our society that you bemoan a bit. Is that true?
I think it's a terrible mistake. You simply can't be happy by pursuing your own happiness. That's where Thomas Jefferson got it wrong. Here's your Philadelphia story connection for you.
Yeah.
Jefferson wrote about the pursuit of happiness. Bad idea. It's the pursuit of meaning. It's a pursuit of a life of significance. It's a pursuit of connecting to other people. Happiness is always a byproduct. You can't pursue happiness. It has to find you.
That's wonderfully put. When I read your book, I was struck by its similarities to another book, a great book that I very much admire, Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning.
Oh boy,
took place, is about life, making meaning, finding meaning in a concentration camp. And you do mention that book in passing.
More than that, I think it's one of the great books of the 20th century. Frankl has had tremendous impact on me. I'm very proud of the fact that Beacon Press has just put out a new edition of Man's Search for Meaning, and they asked me to write the introduction to it.
Is that so? And when will that be available?
It's out now, as a matter of fact. But you know what's interesting? When the book first came out, they got a psychiatrist to write the introduction. For the current reissue, they got a religious leader. And I think they've kindly come to understand, although Frankl was a psychiatrist, this is not a psychiatric book. It's a profoundly spiritual book. Yeah. If you remember Man's Search for Meaning, the last sentence is one of the most religious lines anybody ever wrote in the 20th century. Auschwitz, the death camps, taught us what the human being is. He is the creature who invented the death camps and the creature who entered them saying Shema Yisrael, or the Lord's Prayer. But the line that resonates with me, and it animates my new book, Overcoming Life's Disappointments, when Frankl says, you can't control what happens to you in life. You can always control what you do about what happens to you in life. And that's the advice I give in this book. You start out with a dream of your career, your marriage, your children, how everything is going to work out, and then your dreams collide with reality and they shatter. And what do you do then? You can't control what happened to you, but you can control what you're going to do about it, how you respond.
I think that people are very taken with that, need to hear that. I mean, we all struggle with that every day. I want to talk about the fact that in your book, you use Moses as your archetypal figure of both accomplishment and disappointment. And would you talk a little bit about the choice of that figure?
Paula, so many people have a very narrow notion of Moses. They may get it based on old Sunday school stories. Maybe they saw that dreadful Cecil B. DeMille movie, The Ten Commandments, with Charlton Heston pasting the cotton on his eyebrows. Oh, but it's such okay.
It's hokum, yes.
I grant you the right to like it. But they have this notion of Moses the triumphant, Moses calling down the plagues, Moses splitting the Red Sea, Moses going up the mountain and talking to God with an intimacy nobody else can match. And you can't relate to that. I read the Torah every Sabbath in synagogue, and I find a very different Moses. A Moses who was encountering frustration and disappointment every week, trying to lead a people who do not want to be led by the likes of him. He tells them what to do, and they go and do the opposite. He led them out of slavery, and all they do is complain the food was better in Egypt. What are we doing here?
Yes, that sounds familiar.
That moment, which is the central metaphor of my book, he's presided over God giving the people the 10 Commandments, something that's never happened before, goes up Mount Sinai to get all the other commandments. Halfway down, he hears noise, he looks down, he sees the Israelites dancing around the golden calf. Days after they had promised God that they would not worship idols, they're worshiping an idol. He becomes so distraught, so frustrated, he takes the tablets of the 10 Commandments that God personally inscribed, throws them to the ground, and they shatter. And then, I think that's understandable. But what Moses does next, I think, is just absolutely inspired, and this is where he becomes the model for people like us. He lovingly picks up those broken pieces, carries them with him for the rest of his life, not as a reminder of his failure, as a reminder of his dream, of what he once aspired to achieve. And then he goes back up the mountain, and in collaboration with God, comes up with a second replacement set. The first set of 10 Commandments came directly from God. They demand perfection. They are the ideal. The replacement set is a joint effort of God and humanity, and they are infused with a recognition that you can't expect too much from people. And these are the ones that have lasted for 3,500 years. But that image of his picking up the broken pieces I just find so moving and so inspirational. Paula, I don't need to study the life of Moses to find out how to split the Red Sea. I'll never have occasion to do that. I need to read Moses to find out what to do when my dreams don't work out, what to do when people don't appreciate me, what to do when I just find life has cheated me out of things I was looking forward to. That's where I need to be like Moses.
Well, you do speak about that at length in your book. I mean, you move back and forth between the biblical and the personal and the communal. And one of the things you address that I found particularly interesting and wise was your discussion of marriage. And I wonder if you'd tell us a little bit about how you feel about marriage, because certainly that's an institution we go into with great hope. With a great sense of romance, and the society creates this romantic aura around marriage, and yet, of course, so many marriages do end in divorce.
I think of all the weddings I've performed in all my years as a rabbi, every single one of them ended with the bride and groom with stars in their eyes, smiles on their faces, lovingly, passionately kissing each other. And as they walk away, you have to worry what's going to happen to these people. You know what Freud said about marriage? That there are 4 people involved in every wedding. The girl and the guy she thinks she's marrying, the man and the woman he thinks he's marrying. What do you do when you find out that this person you persuaded yourself was perfect for you is flawed?
Yeah.
And the gift that Moses represents, and the key to it, is something that I call binocular vision. To be able to see a person with both eyes, because, you know, we have 2 eyes, and that permits us to see things in depth. And what you have to do is the people intimately in your life and the other people you deal with, to see them in depth. Yes, you know, the wife gets to the point where she is just fed up with the fact that her husband leaves the toilet seat up, or throws his socks on the floor, or comes home and only wants to talk about how hard his day was and never asks about hers. And she's got to see that and be exasperated. But she's got to see something else. She's got to see this is a guy who gets up early in the morning and goes out and works hard to pay the bills. This is a guy who comes home and loves his kids and wants to play with them and do things with them, and who has hopes and dreams for his children. And the same thing at the other end. The man may think that his wife is disappointing him in one way or another, but he's got to see that, and he's got to see her in depth.
Right.
He's got to see all the qualities, the patience, the forgiveness that she brings to this.
But you go further than that. I mean, you've used some examples that are, I guess, somewhat trivial, but in your book you talk about infidelity, and you talk about overcoming or forgiving, even in the case of infidelity, which some people feel is unforgivable. And I wonder if you would address that.
It can be a deal breaker. It's betrayal. It's a betrayal of trust. But I have said to quite a few women who say to me, for example, I can't look at him without imagining what he was doing with that other woman when I thought he was working late at the office.
Yeah.
And that's where you need the binocular vision. And I will say to them, can you look at him and see something else alongside that? Can you see a devoted father? Can you see a provider? Can you see a basically good man who had this one weakness? And if he has genuinely recognized that it was a mistake and wants to repent, does this have to be the deal breaker? There's an Orthodox Jewish therapist I know whose books I have read who uses the story of Moses and breaking the tablets of the Ten Commandments when he deals with marital conflicts where maybe there has been an affair by either party, and where he says, every marriage breaks at some point and has to be put back together. And every marriage will have cracks, and you try to plaster over the cracks. But you cannot expect human beings to be perfect and to live up to the ideal. You start out with a dream, we will be happy, we will beat the odds, we're going to do it right, and the dream collides with reality. And what do you do then? Do you give up, or do you do what Moses did and put it back together? Hold on to the pieces, remember why you fell in love with that other person in the first place, but at the same time, accept the fact that they are flawed and imperfect.
Yes. I like to say that, in fact, if you stick with a marriage, you fall in love again and again with your spouse in different ways and on different levels.
May I tell you a story?
Yeah.
I was meeting a young couple who would be getting married in my synagogue. I wanted to get to know them, talk to the ceremony about them. And at one point, the bridegroom, the young man, says to me, Rabbi Kushner, would you be willing to make one small change in the Jewish wedding ceremony? Instead of pronouncing us pronouncing us husband and wife till death do us part, would you pronounce us husband and wife for as long as we love each other? We've talked about this, and we've decided if we ever get to the point where we no longer love each other, it's not morally right for us to be stuck with each other.
What did you say to that?
I said, no. I said, no, I'm not going to make that change.
Yeah.
I said, listen, I have some idea where you're coming from. Maybe you saw your parents' marriage, and you vowed you'd never end up like that. Maybe you had a friend who gave himself totally to another person and was badly hurt by that person. But let me tell you something. If you go into this marriage with an attitude of, let's try it out, if it doesn't work, we'll go our separate ways, no hard feelings. If you move in together and you don't entirely unpack, and you keep on asking yourself, am I getting what I need out of this? Instead of asking yourself, am I making this a solid marriage? It's not going to work, because the first time that you hit a wall, the first time you run into a roadblock, you're going to pack up and move out. You just won't have a chance. The whole idea of why people get married rather than just live together is that it is hard to get into and hard to get out of. And it holds you together during all those days of disillusionment.
Right.
Now, clearly, there will be some cases where a relationship dies and nothing is achieved by compelling a person legally to live with the festering corpse of a dead relationship. And at that point, you've got to go your separate ways and start over again. But it is always a last resort. I have told more couples than I can count, spend money on a counselor before you spend it on a lawyer. Because what you're going to do is, how do you know you're not going to make the same mistake again? You thought you were so sure the first time around. Give this a chance. You've invested this in each other. I remember a very thoughtful woman in my congregation saying to me, I have more than enough grounds to kick my husband out of the house. I can't handle the thought of somebody out there in the world unconnected with me sharing 50% of some of the most intimate memories I own.
Interesting. Interesting. Well, you speak, certainly your books are much read and much revered, and I think part of it is that you come from a place of pain yourself, and you've experienced a great loss, and I know that you're not averse to talking about the fact that you lost your son at age 13 to a terrible illness, and I wonder if you'd talk a little bit about how that loss changed you, how it, obviously in some ways it launched your career as a writer, but I wonder what the psychological changes and the ways of coping that you brought to bear that I guess you've tried to explain in your books, how that worked for you at that juncture.
There was a line in my first book, When Bad Things